Which one should you buy? Let's get started. What is good, YouTube? It's that one camera guy back at it again with another video. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the Sony 85 FE 1.8 for full frame. Now, the focus of this review will be looking at autofocusing capabilities in comparison to the Batis 85, as well as the features that the lens offers, and whether or not you should consider getting the Zeiss or the Sony. To be very clear, I want you to know I'm not really testing out the image quality. Alright, so this is an addition to the video. I decided to include my own image test even though I wasn't planning to. I'm not the best expert when it comes to doing these evaluations, but I went ahead and did some side-by-side comparisons to the best of my ability using the Sony 85 as well as the Batis 85. And I did some simple tests. Let's go ahead and take a look at them right now. Alright, the first one I have here is I shot a ladder that had some text on here, and I wanted to make a comparison. I know the video might not do it justice, but in terms of just overall quality between the two, they're very, very close, and I don't really see a dramatic difference. I did manually focus these, and there is a very good chance that I didn't manually focus them very well, or when I took the picture, the camera moved slightly. So those are some possible issues when I did this test. But overall, they look pretty good. In this case, the Zeiss looks slightly sharper than the Sony. And by the way, the left-hand side is always going to be the Sony 85, and the right-hand side is going to be the Batis 85. Let's go ahead and take a look at a 200% zoom in. And as we take a look here, you can see the left side with the Sony and the right side with the Batis. And they also have the same settings. They're all posted right there. And again, they look pretty close in terms of performance. You'll notice that I think what this is called chromatic aberration, you're seeing a little bit more on the Sony here. It's less pronounced on the Zeiss Batis. All right, let's go ahead and jump to this other one. This was just some a fly trap here. Let's zoom in. There's some text in here I want to take a look at. In terms of overall sharpness, I see it's slightly sharper on the Zeiss. Again, that could just be a little bit of issue on the manual focusing side on my part. Again, it's not my biggest strength to do these types of tests. Let's go ahead and jump to a 200% zoom in here, as you can take a look. Again, for the most part, they look fairly sharp, and I might have been off slightly with the manual focusing on the Sony, but there it is again on a closer up scale. All right, let's go ahead and jump to the outdoors now. I did this shot here, and this was a slightly farther away shot, and I guess I'm really looking at the out of focus rendering of how they look. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit more onto the image. I don't really notice any major differences between the two from this distance. Let's go ahead and jump to a 100% jump on that particular image. Here we go. We take a look here. The out of focus rendering, the similarities, they look almost the same. I wouldn't be able to tell directly if there was any difference, but here's where the difference comes into play. So if we take a look, you'll notice there's some chromatic aberration here on this area right here on the actual Starbucks cup. But if you go over here to the Zeiss, you'll notice it's much more controlled, and you don't see that same issue on the actual cup here. So Zeiss definitely has the lead in this situation here, very well controlled. But overall sharpness, I think, is on par with each other. It's just Zeiss is just handling those little issues better. And again, out of focus areas look about the same. All right, let's jump to a closer shot here. Here we go. Again, look at the out of focus areas. They look roughly the same. I'm not noticing any major differences. Again, the Sony's on the left, Batis is on the right. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit here on the shot. Again, the two look pretty good. I mean, I don't see any problems with it. Let's jump to a 50% view here that I took of the two. I'm not noticing any issues on the actual cup in this example like I did in the other one. And on the right hand side with the Zeiss, I'm not noticing it either. And again, the out of focus areas look almost exactly the same. So that is my quick look at image quality on these two lenses. I think they're pretty comparable, and if you're doing photography, you can definitely correct some of those chromatic aberration or purple fringing issues with the Sony F1.8. I really don't think it'd be a big jump to go to the Zeiss in my personal opinion when it comes to photography, but if you want the absolute best, I think the Zeiss definitely has it just slightly in this particular arena. On this lens, reviews have already shown that the image quality between this one and the Batis 85 are very comparable in terms of how they look. Now, I will say the biggest difference between these two things are the features that the lens offers you, the built-in stabilization, and also price. Those are some of the bigger key factors that I know a lot of you are thinking about right now while they're considering between these two models. And honestly, my initial test shooting with this lens compared to the Batis 85 is that image quality wise, they're pretty darn good, and I don't think you'll really be able to tell a big difference. Opening the Sony 85mm box came with no fanfare. You had the typical Sony orange box. You had the same similar packaging with information and warranty card. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was packaged very well. Like, it could have been transported, and I would be very happy and not worried about it being damaged during transport. And the one thing I really like about manufacturers like Sony is that they include the lens hood. Canon, right? For those of you that know what I mean. The lens construction actually really isn't that bad on this lens. I mean, it feels a little plasticky, but solid with some sort of metal finish as well. It's very solid, feels really good in the hands, and it's just reassuring. You know, you're still paying a pretty good penny for this lens, and it does feel really good in the hands. Now, when making comparison to the Sony 50mm F1.8, it does feel similar to that, but it's more solid. That's the way I would look at it. In terms of size, this lens comes in at 371 grams. It's pretty light in comparison to the other ones. The Batis comes in at 475 grams, and the G Master is more than double at 820 grams. So the lens is definitely light, and it balances well on both the A6000 body and the A7 bodies as well. Now, there is something to keep note, is that there's a bulge on both of these lenses that you've noticed from 85mm lenses. Now, the bulge on the Batis is definitely bigger than the one on the Sony, and it can come in handy. Having the lens itself is a little bit smaller, easier to pack in a bag, and slightly lighter, so that might be important to some of you out there. Another thing is that the bulge on the 85 Batis is known to have issues with the tripod plate. So if you have the Batis 85 and you mount a tripod plate to it, it kind of gets in the way. Unfortunately, the issue is still prevalent in the Sony model because of that bulge it has. So that's really not going to be a major deal breaker for either lenses. Noise. The lens is silent. You can't hear it at all. When you compare it to something like the Sony 50mm F1.8, you can hear the autofocusing motor going back and forth, and humming along with that particular lens. Sony did a really good job. They built a lens. I don't really see it. The internal parts moving up and down externally, so all of the movements are happening internally into the lens, which is a really nice thing to have. And again, autofocus is silent, so if you're shooting in a wedding or you need it silent, this lens will definitely deliver for you. AF testing. So in order for me to test out the autofocusing capabilities of the Sony 85 F1.8, I took it out to the Jim White Invitational track meet that was held at McFarland High School. For those of you familiar, this is the McFarland High that was featured in the Disney movie about some cross-country runners. I wanted to see how well the autofocusing system would keep up with the Batis 85. So I did bring this one out as well, and I mounted both of these lenses on two identical Alpha 6300s that I own, just to keep parity between the tests. It made it a lot easier for me to jump from one camera to the other without having to fumble and change lenses on the field. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of hesitant changing lenses on the field, especially with Sony, but I still do it anyway, but with caution. Settings. The settings I use on the camera were as such. I set the drive mode to high plus, which is your 11 frames per second. I had on autofocus continuous, obviously, with lock on flexible spot, whether it was small, medium, or large. I had face tracking both on and off, I tried both, and I set the image quality to JPEG Fine. I really wanted to use RAW, but I didn't want the buffer to become a problem for me while testing the camera out. In my experience, shooting in JPEG will result in a softer image in the final result, so just keep that in mind. In terms of my exposure settings, I kept it at f1.8 for my aperture, ISO was usually low, probably 100 to, I don't know, 400, if not less. And I kept my shutter speed between somewhere like 800 to 2000 based on the situation I was shooting. Results. Initially, when I started shooting at the very beginning, I was getting a lot of misfires on the Sony 85, and I was getting really worried. I was like, man, the autofocusing is really terrible. But I realized that face tracking was causing problems, so I turned that off. And lo and behold, the autofocusing started to work amazingly. So just keep that in mind, that the settings definitely impact those kind of things. So as far as results, I was happy with the overall performance. I tried it with subjects running across from me along the field when they were running. And it hung on to the subjects. It stayed with them for the most part. Now, there were occasions where I would have issues tracking them, but that was more on my part, because when you shoot at 11 frames per second, there's a bit of a gap, like a stop between each photo. And so just moving the camera and keeping track of the subjects can be a problem. So I test those issues to that. But in most cases, it kept track with the subject and I didn't have any issues. You know what's really cool too is that when the runners were going across the track, I had high jumpers kind of in the background. And as soon as the runners were done running, I went and quickly jumped over to the high jumpers. And the camera and the lens combination just locked on very quickly, and it did a really good job. So if you're concerned about autofocusing capabilities with the Sony FE85, rest assured performance is top-notch with this lens. I don't think you have anything to worry about. Lack of stabilization. For sports photography, the lack of stabilization really isn't a big issue because we're typically shooting at high shutter speeds anyway, where stabilization really won't become a factor. Add to the fact that most of the users who are probably picking up this lens have an A7 II series camera or even the Alpha 6500, which all have in-body image stabilization. So if you're picking this lens up and you have a Sony body with no stabilization, then it makes a lot of sense, especially when you're doing video. Now, when I was recording the Green Ranger, I was using the Alpha 6300, and this example is showing you the Sony FE85 without stabilization, obviously. And notice that it's extremely shaky. And I want to keep in mind that I kept it as steady as I could. I had my arms on the armrest and I was holding the camera steady as much as I could, and I was still getting that shake in the footage. So keep that in mind if video is something really important to you and you don't have in-body image stabilization. Now, when I mounted the Batis 85 with stabilization on the Alpha 6300, it's night and day. You can literally see the autofocus kick in, do its job, and it's focused extremely well, and there's literally no shake in the footage. So again, if that is something important to you, definitely the Batis 85 will come into consideration. The focus hold and autofocus switch. I don't know about you, but I really love tactile buttons and switches on my lenses. It's something I kind of missed on the Batis 85. There's like nothing on there. It's just the lens, right? Yes, the LCD display is nice, or the OLED display is nice, but in the long run, it just sucks not having an actual physical switch. So for me, my focus hold button, the settings inside my camera, I typically set it to eye autofocus. This is really great because this lens is built for users who do portrait photography. So if you're a portrait photographer and you want to get eye autofocus, having that tactile button, which doesn't feel too bad, that's on this, will allow you to get better accurate focusing on your subject, which is really nice to have. Now, keep in mind, you can set a button on your camera for eye autofocus if your camera supports it. So it's not a deal breaker, but it's nice to have a tactile button. Now, the autofocus manual focus switch. Every now and then, there's times when I need to quickly switch from autofocus to manual focus. It doesn't happen too often, but the times it does, if I have a lens that doesn't have a switch like the Zeiss 55 or even this one, the 85, it's really frustrating. And having that autofocus manual focus switch saves me just a few seconds from having to dive into the menu and change the autofocusing mode. So this is a really nice addition, and if it's something that you like as far as switches and dials, the Sony FE85 is really nice to have. Focus ring. The focus ring on the 85 is not really something to smile about. I mean, it's adequate. It's not very tactile. It's kind of slippery a little bit, but I'm able to get a good grip around it and rotate the focus ring as need be. Compared to the Batis 85, the focus ring is a little bit bigger with the larger focus strobe, and the rubber grip makes it easier to hold. Now, in my experience using it, I did find that it was just much easier to use the Sony FE because of the shorter focus throw, and I did not have any issues dialing in my focus on either lenses, considering they both use focus by wire. In other words, whatever lens choice you go with, if you use a lot of manual focusing, you're going to be happy with either one. And that's just my opinion though. Conclusion. The Sony 85mm F1.8 is a great value lens, considering the fact that it comes in at half the price of the Batis 85 and almost $1,000 cheaper than the G Master. So if you're going into portrait photography and you have a Sony body that does have in-body image stabilization, I would recommend the Sony FE85, hands down. I don't think that there is a real benefit in strength to the Batis 85 with respect to image quality if they're nearly comparable from the tests that I've seen online. So if that's really not a deal breaker for you, then go ahead and pick up the Sony FE85. The tactile buttons, the autofocusing performance, all come into play. I'm dead serious about that too. So if I were to go back in time and I had to pick between these two lenses, the 85 Batis and the Sony, I would have picked up the Sony. Now the only situation, like I said, is if you don't have stabilization built into the body of the camera, then you might want to look at the Batis 85. But other than that, there really isn't a need for it. Save some money, get the 85 Sony, and call it a day. Well folks, that's all I got for you in this video. If you found it helpful, give this video a like, and if you want to see more content about Sony mirrorless cameras and lenses, consider subscribing. And if you want to support the channel and the work that I do, consider using the affiliate links that I have in the description below. And with that said, I'm your host, Camera Guy, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye.